So what is IP source guard? Well, it builds off of what we've already created with our DHCP snooping binding table, much like dynamic ARP inspection, but instead what we're looking to mitigate against this time is somebody who's forging an IP on the network. So it's going to be taking a look at that IP to MAC, IP and MAC binding table and validating that the IP being used on these untrusted interfaces are actually the IPs issued by either manual implementation of IP or the DHCP process allocating the IP address. And it's going to validate that against, again, the DHCP binding table. So this is another one of those Cisco Catalyst security features that can be implemented on a per port basis. So you have the same concept there of the trusted and untrusted port. But in this case, you configure the IP source guard tool to verify the source addresses either on a MAC or IP basis. If you want to use the MAC basis, then you need to and make sure option 82 is enabled for DHCP operation. But otherwise, it's configured on the interface with the IP verify source command, or you can create the bindings yourself manually with the IP source binding command, where you essentially take the MAC address associated with the VLAN ID, the IP address of the interface, and the interface ID that information is operating on. So let's take a look at what it looks like in CLI to get a better understanding of IP source guard. All right, so let's take a look at IP source guard and what needs to go into that in order to get it configured. Not a whole lot of configuration associated with IP source guard, as long as you're following the rules or guidelines set out in documentation to ensure that you're setting it up properly. So those rules, for instance, you cannot have IP source guard or IP verify source placed on an interface that is a native routed port. So it's got to be a switch port, essentially, is the rule there. If you have, let's see, what else? Not supported on Ether channels. So make sure that these are physical interfaces that you're applying it to. If you're using port security, you're using IP source guard in conjunction with port security to get both the MAC address and IP information validated. Then you need option 82 enabled on the device. You do that with some DHCP snooping commands, which leads me to the next requirement. You must have DHCP snooping enabled, so we have that binding table and that database to refer back to do our validations. So how do we configure it? We have DHCP snooping running on this switch here currently. If we take a look at our show IP DHCP snooping output, we see that we have VLAN 5 configured for DHCP snooping. Our interfaces, our trusted and untrusted interfaces are gig 1/0/12. It is a trusted interfaces. It is a trusted interface. The remaining interfaces, gig 1/0/13 through 17, are all untrusted interfaces, and as such have rate limiting imposed on them. So these are going to be the interfaces that we're going to apply our IP source guard to. Go into interface configuration mode for gigs 1/0/13 through 17, and we issue the command IP verify source. Now this is just to validate the layer 3 information or the IP address information against that DHCP binding table. To work in conjunction with port security, you would add the port security command or keyword. Now obviously you would also need to have port security enabled on the interface, but this allows again for that layer 2 and layer 3, or that MAC address and IP address verification against that IP DHCP snooping binding table. Also, you need to have that option 82 information filled out or supported on the switch. So you do that with the DHCP snooping information option command, and ensure you have your service DHCP service enabled in global configuration mode. By default, that's on, so you probably don't have to worry about that, but just be aware. And you can take a look at the DHCP snooping lecture to see how you can do that. So this is how you would configure the interface to do verification for that source guard, IP source guard configuration. You can also configure your static bindings in global configuration mode with the IP source binding command, and you're binding the MAC address to the VLAN to the IP address, and finally binding it to an interface. Now, this is not actually going to create a binding currently, and let's do some context-sensitive help here. Okay, that is the entire command. So we can validate our configuration. However, we don't have actual devices connected to these switches, nor do we have a DHCP server or a full snooping binding table. This is just for demonstration purposes. If you were to configure or issue the show IP verify source command, and you can do it based off of interface gig1/0/13. You can see we don't have any output, but this is where you verify the IP source guard information. You do it with the IP verify source command. And again, you could do it globally for the device. You see nothing's filled out yet, but this is where you would validate that configuration and ensure that your bindings are correct.